Coming closer, the officer pulled back the blanket. What he saw left no doubt. The woman was dead. No signs of a struggle, no screams, no signs of robbery. At first glance, she was simply sleeping. But her face... Her forehead was covered in blood, and her features were frozen in a terrible grimace, in which pain, fear, and surprise merged. There were no bruises on her arms or legs, which only strengthened the version of the attack while the victim was sleeping. Blood and tissue tests showed no signs of taking sleeping pills or alcohol. When the medical examiner described the destruction of the skull bones, he specified that the force of the blow was such that the frontal bone cracked to the base, something that rarely occurs even in serious accidents. To inflict such a blow, the perpetrator had to be standing almost point blank, practically bending over the body. This meant that the killer was looking the victim in the face. Dear viewers, in the next video releases you will find very intriguing and confusing cases, and in order not to miss them, be sure to subscribe to the channel and please like the video. Kathleen Schlosser was born on October 28, 1952 in Mount Clemens, Michigan. It was a small town not far from Detroit, a quiet, cozy place where people knew each other by name, where children played in the alleys in the summer, and where everyone gathered at the skating rink or at the local church in the winter. Kathleen's parents, Mary and Robert Schlosser, belonged to a respectable and traditional American family. Her father was an engineer, her mother was a schoolteacher. Their home was characterized by discipline, hard work, and, no less importantly, care. Kathleen was an only child, and this only strengthened her bond with her parents. She grew up in an atmosphere of love, but also with an understanding of responsibility, boundaries, and obligations. From an early age, Kathleen showed herself to be a child with a subtle soul. Her upbringing was reflected in her manner of speaking, soft, measured, and in her ability to empathize with others. Already in elementary school, teachers noted her attention to detail, thirst for knowledge, and the rare ability for a child to hear, not just listen. In class, she did not strive to stand out, but it was she who often became a mediator in conflicts between children. She was one of those people who did not need a loud voice to be heard. As a teenager, Kathleen continued to develop comprehensively. Study, sports, social activities, all this was part of her life. At school, she participated in organizing charity events, was a member of the student council, and at the same time managed to help her mother with younger students, coming to her elementary class as a volunteer assistant. These early manifestations of caring for others largely determined her further path in life. After graduating from school with honors, Kathleen entered Alma College, a private educational institution in northern Michigan, known for its academic rigor and emphasis on liberal arts education. She chose a double major, economics and psychology. This combination seemed unusual at first glance, but for Kathleen it was natural. She wanted to understand how not only the world of numbers and systems worked, but also the world of emotions and human decisions. She was interested in how people think, what motivates them, how relationships in society and the family are structured. It was at Alma College that she met James Krausnick, a student studying economics. Tall, reserved, ambitious, he immediately attracted Kathleen's attention. Their relationship developed quickly, but not spontaneously. Both were mature for their age, and both strove for stability. In the eyes of others, they were the perfect couple, intelligent, balanced, purposeful. In 1974, they got married. The wedding was modest, but very warm, with a narrow circle of close people and sincere promises for the future. After the wedding, Kathleen and James did not stay in Michigan for long. James's career was developing rapidly. He was invited to work at Eastman Kodak, then one of the largest companies in the country, located in Rochester, New York. The move was an important step. It meant the beginning of a new life. Adult, independent, and, as it seemed to them then, promising. Kathleen left her hometown and followed her husband, not feeling fear, only slight excitement. She believed in them as a team. In Rochester, they settled in a cozy house in the suburb of Brighton, an area where mainly families with children lived. And in the evenings, you could hear children playing and lawnmowers working on the streets. Kathleen quickly adapted to her new life. She arranged the house, took care of the household, got to know the neighbors. Despite the fact that in those years, women often had to choose between a career and a family, Kathleen did not perceive herself as a housewife in the usual sense. For her, taking care of the house was not a duty, but a form of love. In 1979, the most important event in their lives happened. Their daughter Sarah was born. Kathleen was delighted. Motherhood was not a test for her, but a new level of life. She spent almost all her time with her daughter. She read books to her, took her for walks, and sewed her clothes and jewelry herself. Friends recalled how Kathleen went out with Sarah to the nearby park every day, how patiently she explained to the little girl how the world works, and how reverently she treated every moment of their time together. Along with motherhood, Kathleen continued to develop intellectually. She visited the local library, was interested in pedagogy and child psychology, and was thinking about returning to school or teaching when Sarah grew up a little. She was drawn to knowledge, but most of all, to people. She was not eager to pursue a career, but she always wanted to be useful, to be needed. Not just a wife or a mother, but a person who influences the lives of others, even if quietly, almost imperceptibly. People who knew her said that being around Kathleen made you feel calmer. She seemed to radiate inner composure, even in moments of fatigue or anxiety, and there were certainly moments like that. She tried not to lose her composure. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't complain. It seemed like she had an inner core that kept her balanced. She believed in family, in work, in the fact that love is an action, not just a feeling. From the outside, their family seemed exemplary. A nice house, her husband's respected job, a well-behaved daughter, a well-kept garden, evening walks around the neighborhood, Sunday dinners, vacation photos, plans for the future. Everything looked right. Kathleen was a person who creates stability, not looks for it. A person who is not afraid of everyday life and finds meaning in it. In the early 1980s, Kathleen Krauseneck was a woman whose life had everything that seemed important: family, health, the respect of others, and the feeling that every new day was an opportunity to do something good. She didn't look for drama, didn't strive for fame. She simply lived, sincerely, honestly, deeply. The morning of February 19, 1982, began in Rochester with the usual February silence. Winter in New York State can be harsh, and this day was no exception. Gray skies, snow-covered sidewalks, a light wind blowing between the houses. Around 7 in the morning, the suburb of Brighton, where the Krauseneck family lived, still had a sleepy atmosphere. Neighbors' cars were covered in frost, dim lights burned in the windows of houses. People were just getting ready for work, eating breakfast, walking the dogs. The day promised nothing unusual. For Kathleen Krauseneck, everything should have gone as usual. Her husband, James, worked at Eastman Kodak and usually left home early, around 6:30 a.m. Sarah, their 5-year-old daughter, was still asleep at this time. Kathleen, as a rule, rose a little later. She made breakfast, did her hair, helped Sarah get dressed. The family had a well-established routine, and each day followed roughly the same script. Mornings were a time of quiet and order for them. But on this day, everything was different, although at first, it seemed insignificant. At about 9 in the morning, the door of the Krausenecks' house opened. Little Sarah, dressed inappropriately for the weather, in leggings, without a coat, with bare feet and slippers, went outside and headed to the neighboring house. She knocked. Jack Howard, a neighbor who knew the family well, opened the door. Before him stood a girl with a confused expression. She said quietly, "Mom is not feeling well. Dad is already at work." Jack did not immediately understand the seriousness of what was happening. He thought that Kathleen was probably just sick. But Sarah's voice and her appearance, frightened, lost, were alarming. Howard immediately called the Krausenecks' house, but no one answered. Then he approached the house with Sarah. He knocked. Silence. Then he opened the unlocked door and called Kathleen. There was no answer. The house seemed calm inside. No screams, no signs of panic. Sarah went to the living room, to where her favorite toy stood. Jack walked carefully through the house. Everything looked as if people were just out on business. There were cups in the kitchen, the table was neatly set, the remains of breakfast on the stove. An ordinary morning. Only one thing worried. Where was Kathleen? Trying not to disturb Sarah, Jack slowly climbed the stairs. From above, from the second floor, not a sound came. He walked along the hallway, reached the master bedroom, and looked inside. The light was off. The curtains were drawn. Everything seemed frozen in the morning darkness. At first glance, nothing caught his eye. He took a step forward. The room greeted him with an ominous silence. A slight draft stirred the edge of the curtain, and into this almost theatrical silence, there was an anxiety that could not be rationally explained. A silhouette lay on the bed. It seemed as if someone was simply sleeping, wrapped in a blanket. But even from a distance, it was clear that something was wrong. An unnatural pose, a completely covered face. Jack took another step and stopped. He did not come closer. He slowly walked out of the bedroom, went downstairs, led Sarah out of the house, and called the police. The first to arrive at the scene was an officer from the local department. On the way to the scene, he received preliminary information. A woman with no signs of life, a 5-year-old child in the house. The husband is at work. The policeman quickly assessed the situation. Sarah was sitting with the neighbors, and Howard's wife was already with her. The girl was silent. She was just hugging a plush bunny. The officer entered the house. Everything really looked too calm. And there was something creepy in this calm. He followed the same routes as Jack and soon found himself in the bedroom. This time, with a flashlight and a camera. The room looked untouched. The bed was slightly rumpled on the nightstand. A clock, a book, a glass of water. And again, a silhouette on the bed, completely covered with a blanket. Coming closer, the officer threw back the covers. What he saw left no doubt. The woman was dead. No signs of a struggle, no screams, no signs of robbery. At first glance, she was just sleeping. But her face, her forehead was covered in blood, and her features were frozen in a terrible grimace, in which pain, fear, and surprise merged. It was Kathleen Krauseneck, a woman whose life seemed to be just beginning. A wife, a mother, a neighbor. Now, a body in a quiet house where everything looked so ordinary. Death that entered the comfort, disrupted the usual course of events, burst into a life full of plans and routine concerns. Murder, right in the heart of their family nest. And no one yet understood. How could this happen? Who? When? Why? And most importantly, why did little Sarah, being in the same house, remain unharmed, but was forced to be the first to tell the world that something was wrong with her mother? The house was immediately cordoned off. The stage began in which, due to one tragic event, the usual ideas about safety, trust, and predictability of life collapsed. At that moment, no one knew how painful the path to the truth would be. But it all began here, in a house on Delaware Drive, where an ordinary February morning ended in horror. When the first forensics officers arrived on Delaware Drive, they were faced with what seemed like a simple task: a murder in a house. One person dead, one dead at work, one dead as a child. Minimal evidence, minimal witnesses. But the deeper the police dug into the details, the more inconsistencies the case began to have. Starting an investigation was like entering a dense fog. Everything seemed clear, but every step revealed contradictions and unanswered questions. Kathleen Krauseneck was found dead in her bed, in a house that showed no obvious signs of forced entry. The front door was closed but not locked, which was not unusual by suburban standards. However, none of the windows were broken, and the locks were intact. There were no traces of dirt from shoes inside. Everything pointed to the fact that the perpetrator either entered the house without breaking in, or was already inside. This detail became key for the forensic experts. The lack of signs of forced entry significantly narrowed the circle of suspects. The forensic expert, examining the body, determined that death occurred as a result of a strong blow to the head. The damage was located in the area of the left temporal bone, and was accompanied by severe craniocerebral trauma. Presumably, the blow was inflicted by a single object with significant mass and a blunt edge, The depth and shape of the damage suggested that the object used had a clearly defined shape, perhaps a tool or household item, such as an axe or hammer. However, it was not possible to identify the specific weapon. It was not found in the bedroom or in other rooms of the house. An important finding was that there were no traces of multiple injuries on the skin around the wound. This indicated that the blow was sudden, and most likely the only one. However, it was this blow that turned out to be fatal. There were no signs of a struggle, no bruises on the arms or legs, which only strengthened the version of the attack while the victim was sleeping. Blood and tissue tests showed no signs of taking sleeping pills or alcohol. Everything indicated that Kathleen simply fell asleep and never woke up. The area around the body on the bed was also carefully examined. The blood remained mostly localized in the area of the pillow and the top of the mattress. This indicated that the body was not moved after the blow, and the victim did not get up or move. Her death occurred quickly. The fatal blow, according to the medical examiner, was delivered with such force that it caused almost instantaneous loss of consciousness, and then respiratory arrest. Fingerprints, exclusively belonging to family members. Fibers, hair, DNA, all within the normal range for a residential area. It was as if there were no strangers in the house. A logical question arose. Could the killer be someone Kathleen knew and was not afraid of? When the police contacted James Krausneck, he was already at work at Kodak. The call found him in the office, where he was supposedly holding a business meeting. Upon hearing the news, according to his colleagues, he looked shocked. He immediately left work and headed home. James's behavior initially did not arouse suspicion. He said that he left home at about 6:30 in the morning, as always. Kathleen, according to him, was still asleep. He did not hear anything unusual, did not notice suspicious people on the street. The morning was as usual. However, already during the first interrogation, some details began to raise doubts. Firstly, the lack of obvious emotions. James looked reserved, too calm for a man who lost his wife in such circumstances. Of course, this was not direct evidence. People react differently to shock, especially men, who are used to suppressing their feelings. But the investigators still made a note. His reaction was restrained, almost mechanical. Secondly, the discrepancy with the time of death. The coroner estimated that Kathleen was killed around 3 to 5 a.m. This meant that the crime occurred when she, James, and their daughter were all in the house. Therefore, if James really left at 6:30, the murder must have occurred before that time. But didn't he hear anything suspicious? Notice any blood? See the body? The house isn't that big. It's hard to imagine that he could have walked past the bedroom where his dead wife lay and not noticed anything strange. Third, Sarah's behavior. The girl, aged 5, couldn't give precise testimony, but her words were an important element. She said that Mommy was lying there and not moving, and that Daddy had gone to work. So she had already seen the body. But why didn't she say so right away? Why did she decide to leave the house only around 9 a.m., several hours after her father had left? Or did she not understand what had happened? These questions remained open. But one thing especially alarmed the investigators. Sarah claimed that she had slept all night and had not heard any screams or noise. This confirmed the assumption that the murder had happened quietly and quickly. The police began checking everyone who could be connected to the family. But the Krausnecks' circle of friends was quite narrow. No conflicts, no threats, no ex-partners or quarrels. Neighbors spoke of the family exclusively positively. Kathleen was friendly, calm, taught economics, and was actively involved in school life. James was intelligent, a little distant, but polite. They were considered the perfect family. Only one thing caused slight concern. According to some neighbors, the relationship between the spouses seemed less warm than before. Less talking, less smiling. It was not something loud, rather, barely noticeable cracks. Meanwhile, investigators began studying James Krausnecks' professional and personal biography. They soon discovered one unexpected detail. His PhD, on the basis of which he was hired at Kodak, turned out to be fake. The diploma, allegedly issued by the University of Colorado, was not listed in their database. This fact cast doubt on his entire professional reputation. And most importantly, it raised a serious question for the police. Could a person capable of large-scale falsification be capable of a more serious crime? Despite suspicions, there was no evidence against James. No fingerprints, no traces of blood on his clothes. His version of events was stable. He claimed that he did not know what happened to his wife and that he was at work at the time of the crime. The police conducted an examination of his clothes, shoes, car. Everything was clean. This became an obstacle to bringing charges. The investigation began to reach a dead end. Nevertheless, the case was not closed. Detectives saved materials, took interviews, analyzed details again and again. By this time, the press had already picked up the story. Tragedy in Brighton, teacher found dead, family drama or invasion from outside. Society was excited, but the police did not have sufficient grounds to bring charges. James, meanwhile, left Rochester and soon remarried. He started a new life, leaving behind the house that had become a symbol of the tragedy. The investigation continued for some time, but without progress. The case was filed away, as one of many unsolved crimes. However, as often happens in the world of forensic science, it was not forgotten. It was waiting for new technology, new eyes, new evidence. And in the future, it was this waiting that would play a decisive role. But at that time, in 1982, the police were forced to admit there was no direct evidence, no charges could be brought. The mystery of Kathleen Krausenek's death remained unsolved for a while. However, in 2015, the case was resurfaced, thanks to the persistence of a new generation of investigators and the development of forensic technology. The investigation was taken up by Detective Robert Franklin, an officer from Monroe County specializing in unsolved murders. Franklin didn't know Kathleen or live in Rochester in 1982, but the case had caught his attention from the first page. It looked clean. A perfect family, no suspects, no leads, but that was precisely what he found suspicious. Franklin started where many others would have started. He went back to the body. New methods of analysis and computer reconstruction of the skull made it possible to pinpoint the angle and force of the blow, as well as the trajectory. The experts concluded that such a blow could not have been delivered in a hurry. It was precise, targeted, almost surgical. At the same time, the circumstances of the morning of the murder were re-examined. The key was the old examination, the time of death between 3:30 and 5 a.m. If James had indeed left home at 6:30, as he claimed, then he was in the house at the time of the murder, or at least in the immediate vicinity of the time it was committed. Sarah's behavior also raised doubts. The 5-year-old girl left the house only a few hours after her father left, but she already knew that Mom wasn't moving. This meant that Kathleen's body had been in the house all this time, and James could not have failed to notice it when he was getting ready for work. Another alarming moment. The FBI joined in a reanalysis of the circumstances, and soon a long-forgotten but extremely important fact came into view. There were no signs of someone else's entry into the house. No shoe prints, no fingerprints, no fibers that did not belong to the family. This meant that the killer either knew how to get inside without leaving a trace, or was already in the house. And most importantly, the missing murder weapon. According to the investigation, it was taken from the crime scene. And this could only have been done by a person who left the house later than everyone else, and did so without haste. Everything pointed to James, 37 years. That's how long it took for the Kathleen Krausenek case to return to the spotlight. Nearly 4 decades is enough time for a generation to grow up and for evidence to disappear. In 2019, decades later, the Monroe County prosecutor formally charged James Krausenek with second-degree murder. It sparked a wave of public interest. A man who had lived his entire life without reproach, held a respected position, been a model citizen and husband, was in the dock. Many wondered, why? Why would a man with a family, a career, and respect kill his wife? The prosecutor's answer was harsh but pragmatic. Fear of exposure. James had forged a diploma, and his career at Kodak was hanging by a thread. If the truth came out, he would lose everything. His job, his reputation, his status. Perhaps he was afraid that Kathleen found out or was going to tell, and so he made a decision that proved fatal. The trial began in September 2022. It took place in Rochester, in the county courthouse, the very one James had been driving past for decades, never suspecting that one day he would find himself inside, accused of murdering his wife. Journalists, former colleagues, neighbors, and family friends came to the hearings. The defense claimed that there was no direct evidence against their client, no DNA, no witnesses, no fingerprints. Everything was based on circumstantial evidence and an analysis of long-standing behavior. But the prosecution confidently insisted that the totality of the data, expert opinions, time frames, and the lack of alternative versions were irrefutable. During the hearing, the prosecution presented photographs from the crime scene that had never been published before. These images caused visible shock among some of the audience. Even the jurors looked away. One of the key moments was a reconstruction of the blow using a dummy and a forensic hammer, shown in the courtroom. Experts recreated the moment of the attack, and it looked amazingly accurate. The prosecution argued that in order to inflict such a blow, the perpetrator had to be standing almost point blank, practically leaning over the body. This meant that the killer was looking the victim in the face. When the forensic expert described the destruction of the skull bones, the courtroom froze. He specified that the force of the blow was such that the frontal bone cracked to the base, something that is rare even in serious accidents. It was hypothesized that the victim could have felt the blow approaching, but did not have time to react. This moment brought tears to one of Kathleen's former friends, who was sitting in the courtroom. The defense tried to question the examination, but was forced to admit that the technology of the 1980s did not leave as many traces as it would today. A shocking moment came when the prosecutor asked James Krosnick the question, "Did you look your wife in the eyes when you raised your hand with the axe?" And absolute silence reigned in the courtroom. James was silent for a few seconds before answering that he did not commit the murder. But this silence seemed to speak louder than any words. A psychologist called in by the prosecution presented an analysis of Krausenek's behavior after the crime. He did not call Kathleen's relatives, did not express an emotional reaction, did not visit her grave for 15 years. In addition, just a few months after her death, he began dating a new woman and took his daughter to another state. One of James's former colleagues said that on the day after the murder, he came to work, calm, as if nothing had happened. And this amazed even the management. And a former neighbor of the family said that on the morning of the tragedy, she saw James throwing a large dark bag into a garbage can behind the house. This fact had previously been ignored by the investigation, but now sounded like a key moment. The culmination was the speech of Sarah Krausenek, already an adult woman. She had long avoided public comment, but in court, she delivered a neutral but difficult speech. She did not directly say that she believed her father was guilty, but she did not defend him either. This silence was more eloquent than any accusation. There was evidence of a long-standing trauma in her voice, a trauma that may have been inflicted by the very man who was supposed to protect her. After several days of deliberation, the jury retired to deliberate. The public could only wait, and on September 22, 2022, 40 years after the tragedy, the verdict was announced. Guilty. James Krausenek was found guilty of second-degree murder. The court sentenced him to 25 years in prison. He was taken into custody right in the courtroom. He was 70 years old. It seemed that justice had been done. But there was no easy sense of closure in this story. The case of Kathleen Krausenek became a symbol of how the truth can wait decades. It showed that even seemingly perfect families can harbor darkness, and that a secret buried under the weight of years can be brought to light again, if someone is brave enough to dig deep enough.